Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight on this beautiful summery evening here in Eugene. My name is Julia Hayden, and I'm the Associate Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. And it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the final big lecture in our year-long series on conflict, and also to the 2011-2012 Kritikos Lecture in the Humanities with Professor Andrew Bacevich. The Kritikos Lecture was established in 1996 for the purpose of bringing leading thinkers and scholars to Oregon to, quote, promote intelligent critical public discourse, end quote. The endowment was created with the aim of supporting speakers who are willing to take on controversial current topics and speak their minds openly and honestly, even if what they have to say might be unfashionable or go against the grain, as the donor says. So given the lectureship's mandate and our annual theme of conflict, Andrew Bacevich seemed like a perfect fit for this year's Kritikos lectureship. A leading expert on U.S. military history and foreign policy, Bacevich is eminently capable and qualified to give us intelligent, critical public discourse on an important, timely, and in some quarters, decidedly controversial subject. Before I introduce Professor Bacevich, I'd like to take care of just a couple of logistical details, if I could. First, there will be a question and answer period immediately following the lecture. And because the lecture is being live streamed right now on the web and also videotaped, we ask that you come to one of the microphones in the two aisles here if you would like to ask a question so that it can be heard both remotely and by people here in the room. And we also ask that you keep your questions brief to allow everyone who wishes to participate a chance to speak. If for some reason you are unable to come to one of the microphones in the aisle, an OHC staff member will be happy to bring you a handheld microphone, so just raise your hand if you want to ask a question and can't come to the mic. Second, I want you to know there will be a book sale and signing. You may have seen the table out in the lobby of the UO bookstore. There will be a book sale and signing immediately following the conclusion of the question and answer period, and we hope you will join us for that. You'll also see out in the lobby a table against the more southern wall with information about the Oregon Humanities Center. And if for some reason you are not on one of our mailing lists, either the electronic one or the hard copy one, and would like to be, you can stop by that table and give us your contact information, and we'd be happy to include you on future mailings, either electronic or hard copy, about our events. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff of the Oregon Humanities Center for all of their work in putting this event together. Peg Gerhardt for her compelling and artistically beautiful publicity materials, Melissa Gustafson for her detailed event coordination efforts, and Lindsay Rogers for all of her logistical support. None of our public events would be possible without the collective efforts of our entire staff, so we're very grateful for everyone's contributions. I'd also like to thank our colleagues in EMU Event Services and the staff of the Knight Library Center for Media and Educational Technologies for their technical assistance with tonight's event. Now I'd like to share with you just a few biographical notes about tonight's distinguished guest. Before becoming a professor of history and international relations, Andrew Bacevich was a career officer in the U.S. Army, serving in that capacity for 23 years. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1969 and served in the United States Army in Vietnam in 1970 and 1971. He later served in Germany and in the Persian Gulf, retiring at the rank of colonel in the early 1990s. Upon retiring from the military, Bacevich turned his energy and attention to writing and to an academic career. He received his PhD in American diplomatic history from Princeton University and taught at West Point and Johns Hopkins before joining the faculty at Boston University in 1998, where he directed the Center for International Relations from 1998 to 2005. His areas of specialization include American diplomatic and military history, U.S. foreign policy, and security studies. Andrew Bacevich is the author of several books, including most recently The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism in 2008, and Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War in 2010. He is also the editor of a newly released collection of essays titled The Short American Century, a Postmortem, that came out, I think, just in March of 2012. All three of those titles, I believe, will be available at the book sale and signing out in the lobby after the lecture. Professor Bacevich is also an active essayist and reviewer, and his essays and pieces have appeared in a variety of scholarly and general interest publications, including the Wilson Quarterly, the National Interest, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Nation, and the New Republic. His op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Boston Globe, and the Los Angeles Times, among other newspapers. So now, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Andrew Bacevich.
Well, thank you very much. My wife and I had never visited south of Portland before. I'd been in Portland a couple times giving talks, and so it was very pleasant for us to drive down here today and see your community and this university. And after we were here for a couple hours, my wife said to me, "So what do people complain about?" And I said to Julia, "My wife wants to know what people complain about." And Julia said, "Well, it rains from time to time." And I thought to myself, well, if that's your biggest gripe in life, you're doing okay. So, as I understand it, we have until 9 o'clock. So basically we've got 80 minutes. Is that right? Roughly. And I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. And so we have a little bit of a problem here, and I'm going to ask your assistance. And the problem is that I've got the lecture, but the lecture, there's a short version and a long version. And the short version ends at page 16, and the long version goes to page 25. So the formal title is A Decade of War and the End of the American Century. Up to page 16 is A Decade of War. The rest of it is the end of the American century. And so the question is, in order so that we can have enough time for discussion, do we do the short version or the long version? No. So here's the plan. When I get to the end of the short version, I'm going to pause and I'm going to clear my throat. And if people want the short version, as soon as I clear my throat, raise your hand to indicate that you want to ask a question. And I will take that as an indicator that I've talked long enough. If, when I clear my throat, nobody raises their hands, then we do the long version. Okay? So it's going to take a while to get there, but that's the clearing of the throat's the cue. So with that confusing introduction, let me begin. Several weeks ago, I received an email from a young American Army officer. Let's call him Mike. I've never actually met Mike. He's the friend of a friend. But I had in the past solicited his views on a couple of matters. That's how we had connected. Mike received his commission more than a decade ago, right around the time the enterprise once widely known as the Global War on Terrorism was kicking off. Over the course of that decade, Mike completed several tours in Iraq, by all reports serving with valor and distinction. As I understand it, Mike has also struggled with PTSD. Mike's email, sent not just to me, but to a long list of contacts, announced that he was leaving the Army for good. And his email included the following reflection, and I'm quoting now. During those days, he's recalling his time as a cadet at West Point prior to 9/11, during those days, war seemed only a vague possibility, something that we would never see in a postmodern world that was quickly flattening with the technological revolution. If war was to come, I expected it to be a 100-hour affair, and I would be riding gloriously on a tank, dutifully serving my country. Well, back then, Mike's naive expectations of war were widely shared, both within the United States military and across American society. In a post-Cold War world in which the most important questions of political economy had been settled, and over which the United States presided as the self-described indispensable nation, war was going to be an increasingly rare occurrence. And when war did occur, the manifest military supremacy of the United States, demonstrated, for example, in 1991's Operation Desert Storm, seemingly ensured that any conflict would be a brief one, ending with U.S. forces unambiguously triumphant. Well, Mike and his fellow soldiers paid a heavy price for such illusions. In his abbreviated military career, Mike knew nothing but war. For those in uniform after 9/11, war became a permanent condition. And Mike encountered little by way of glory. Translating U.S. military superiority into politically meaningful outcomes proved to be frustratingly difficult and far more costly than anyone in Washington had foreseen. Preparing to take off that uniform for the last time, Mike rendered his own verdict on America's post-9/11 wars. In a world of us versus them, he wrote, violence only begets violence. Far out there, on the outskirts of modernity, war is still raging. And I'm not surprised to see the renewed strategies of the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or the Sunnis' reaction to the Shia attempts at pacification in Iraq. These are the most likely courses of action for the have-nots when they feel there is no alternative other than occupation or slavery. Well, that judgment is a harsh one. Certainly, U.S. forces do not see themselves as occupiers, and they did not arrive in Afghanistan or Iraq proclaiming their intention to enslave the population. Nonetheless, Mike has more than earned the right to express his views. And what is incontestable is that the wars have not gone as American soldiers had hoped for or expected. Nor have those wars produced the happy results that U.S. policymakers had forecast. Mike's disappointment, anger, and bitterness are more than understandable. Well, what went wrong? How exactly did we get here? And what conclusions can we draw from our post-9/11 military experience? Let me attempt to answer those questions by first providing an abbreviated count of recent U.S. military history. With the United States now well into the second decade of what the Pentagon itself has styled a, quote, era of persistent conflict, the war formerly known as the global war on terrorism appears increasingly fragmented and diffuse. Without achieving victory, yet unwilling to acknowledge failure, the United States military has withdrawn from Iraq, leaving that country deeply scarred and in considerable disarray. It is trying to leave Afghanistan, where events seem equally unlikely to yield a happy outcome, a point that events of the past several weeks have certainly emphasized. Yet, of course, it is a mistake for us to think that Iraq and Afghanistan alone describe this so-called war on terror. Elsewhere, in Pakistan, Libya, Yemen, and Somalia, for example, U.S. forces have been busily opening up new fronts. Published reports that the United States is establishing, quote, a constellation of secret drone bases in or near the Horn of Africa suggest that the scope of operations will widen further. Navy plans to convert an aging amphibious landing ship into what the Navy calls an afloat-forward staging base, in effect a mobile launch platform for commando raids, that also reinforces the point. Yet as some fronts close down and other fronts open up, the war's narrative has become increasingly difficult to discern. How much farther until we reach this war's equivalent of Richmond or Berlin? What exactly is the war on terror's equivalent of Richmond or Berlin? Is there a storyline here? Viewed close up, the war appears over the course of a decade to have lost form or shape. Take a couple steps back, however, and important patterns begin to appear. What follows is a preliminary attempt to chart and to score this era of persistent conflict. My provisional account portrays the war as a sort of boxing match. It divides the bout into 3 rounds. Although there may well be several additional rounds still to come, and I expect there will be, here's what we've suffered through thus far. Round 1, liberation. More than any other figure, more than any general, even more than the president himself, Donald Rumsfeld dominated the war's early stages. Appearing for a time to be a larger-than-life figure, the Secretary of Defense was called the Secretary at War in the eyes of adoring, if fickle, fans. Rumsfeld was dedicated to the proposition that speed holds the key to victory. U.S. forces are smarter and more agile than any adversary. Employed in ways to take advantage of those qualities, they are therefore sure to win. The term the journalists embraced to describe this conflict was shock and awe. And indeed, this was war as Mike imagined it to be. No one believed more passionately in shock and awe than Rumsfeld himself. The design of Operation Enduring Freedom, launched in October 2001, and of Operation Iraqi Freedom, begun in March of 2003, reflected this belief. In each instance, the campaign got off to a promising start, with U.S. troops landing some impressive blows. But in neither case were they able to finish off their opponent. Unfortunately for Rumsfeld, the terrorists, as we called them, played by different rules. In all the ways that counted, U.S. forces proved to be less smart and less agile than their technological edge implied. Indeed, they proved surprisingly slow to figure out what hit them. In Afghanistan, Rumsfeld let victory slip through his grasp, at least in part because he and others in the Bush administration were eager to move on to the next phase of their plan to transform the greater Middle East. The focus of that next phase was Iraq. There, Rumsfeld's egregious mismanagement of the campaign brought the United States face to face with outright defeat. Rumsfeld's boss had hoped to liberate the Islamic world in a series of short, quick thrusts. What President Bush got instead was 2 different versions of a long, hard slog. By the end of 2006, shock and awe was kaput. Trailing well behind the rest of the country and well behind the armed forces, the president eventually lost confidence in his defense secretary's approach. Rumsfeld lost his job, and round 1 came to an end, the Americans, rather embarrassingly, having lost it on points. Round 2, pacification. enter General David Petraeus. More than any other figure, in or out of uniform, Petraeus dominated the War on Terror's second phase. Round 2 opened with lowered expectations. Gone was the heady talk of liberation. Gone, too, were predictions of lightning victories. The United States was now willing to settle for less, and it was going to pay more for that less than anyone had anticipated. In effect, Petraeus offered a formula for restoring a semblance of order to countries reduced to chaos as a result of Round 1. Order might permit the United States to extricate itself while being able to claim that it had achieved some semblance of its policy objectives. Extrication, without having to admit abject policy failure, became the operative definition of victory. The formal name for the formula that Petraeus devised was counterinsurgency, or COIN. Rather than trying to defeat the enemy outright, COIN sought to facilitate the emergence of a viable and stable nation-state, winning the hearts and minds of the people. This was the stated aim of the surge in Iraq, ordered by President George W. Bush at the end of 2006, following Rumsfeld's ouster. Excuse me. With Petraeus presiding over the Iraq surge, violence in that country declined precipitously. That was not the clearing of the throat. You got to make sure you give the right cues or people can misunderstand. With Petraeus presiding over the Iraq surge, violence in that country declined precipitously. Whether the relationship was causal or coincidental remains the subject of controversy. In typical fashion, however, most American observers preferred to ascribe indications of progress to American actions. After all, it's what we do, not what others do, that matters, at least in our own eyes. I'm sorry. At any rate, in short order, Petraeus' apparent success in Iraq persuaded some observers that counterinsurgency on a global scale, G-COIN, they called it, should now form the basis for U.S. national security strategy. Here, they argued, was the approach that would enable the United States to extract from the war on terror victory of a sort. Rather than employing shock and awe to liberate the Islamic world, U.S. forces would employ counterinsurgency doctrine to pacify the Islamic world. The task of demonstrating the validity of COIN beyond Iraq fell to General Stanley McChrystal, appointed with much fanfare in 2009 to command U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. Press reports at the time celebrated McChrystal as another Petraeus, the ideal candidate to replicate the achievements credited to King David. McChrystal's ascendancy came at a moment when a cult of generalship gripped Washington. Rather than technology being the determinant of success, as Rumsfeld had believed, the key was to put the right guy in charge and then let him run. Political and media figures fell all over themselves in declaring McChrystal the right guy for Afghanistan. Well, once installed in Kabul, the general surveyed the situation and, to no one's surprise, announced that, quote, success demands a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign. Implementing that campaign would necessitate an Afghanistan surge mirroring the Iraq surge that had seemingly turned that war around. And in December of 2009, albeit with little evident enthusiasm, President Barack Obama acceded to his field commander's request, which was tantamount to an ultimatum, and the U.S. troop commitment to Afghanistan rapidly increased. Here, however, things began to become undone. Progress toward reducing the insurgency or winning Afghan hearts and minds came at an achingly slow pace. McChrystal made promises that he proved unable to keep. notably the famous vow to produce, quote, government out of a box that would satisfy basic Afghan needs. Relations with the government of Hamid Karzai remained strained. Those with neighboring Pakistan were hardly better. Both governments resented what they viewed as high-handed American behavior that killed or maimed non-combatants with disturbing frequency and that trampled on Afghan and Pakistani sensibilities. To make matters worse, despite all the hype, McChrystal turned out to be miscast. Rather than the right guy for the job, he was manifestly the wrong one, unable to grasp the imperative of projecting at least some pretense of respecting the principle of civilian control. By the summer of 2010, McChrystal was out and Petraeus was back in. Well, Petraeus' oversized reputation restored a sense of calm after McChrystal's flameout. Surely, the most celebrated soldier of his generation would repeat the magic he had performed in Iraq, affirming his own greatness and the continued viability of coin. Alas, this was not to be. Conditions in Afghanistan during Petraeus' tenure in command improved only modestly. The war continued, having become the embodiment of a military quagmire. Talk of a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign faded. Passing off the fight to Afghan security forces and hightailing it for home became the publicly announced war aim. The bar defining success slipped ever lower. Unable to finish the job, Petraeus eventually retired, still held in high esteem, but with the cult of generalship looking more than a little worse for wear. His successor was General John Allen, who thereby became the 8th U.S. officer appointed to preside over the ongoing Afghanistan war. And if you read the papers this morning, you will know that there is going to be a 9th because General Allen is going to be reassigned this summer. But by the time Allen himself arrived in Kabul, enthusiasm for coin was already notable by its absence. And on this inconclusive note, round 2 of the War on Terror is winding down. Yet even before it ended, round 3 had begun. Round 3, assassination. Unlike Donald Rumsfeld or David Petraeus, Michael Vickers has not achieved celebrity status. Yet more than anyone else in or out of uniform, Vickers, who carries the title Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, deserves recognition as the emblematic figure of the War on Terror's Round 3. His low-key, low-profile persona meshes perfectly with the latest evolution in this war's character. Few people outside of Washington know who Vickers is, as he presides over a war that few people outside of Washington bother to attend to. With the retirement of Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, Vickers is now the senior remaining holdover from George W. Bush's Pentagon. His background is nothing if not eclectic. As a young man, he served in the U.S. Army Special Forces, and he also served as a CIA operative who played a leading role in supporting the Afghan Mujahideen in their war against Soviet occupiers. Subsequently, Vickers worked in a Washington think tank and earned a PhD at Johns Hopkins University. Even during the Bush era, Vickers never subscribed to expectations that the United States could liberate or pacify the Islamic world. His preferred approach to waging war is simplicity itself. I just want to kill those guys, he says. Those guys referring to members of Al-Qaeda. Kill the people who want to kill Americans and don't stop until they are all dead. This defines the Vickers strategy, which over the course of the Obama presidency has supplanted coin as the latest variant of U.S. strategy. For Vickers, this means acting aggressively to eliminate would-be killers wherever they might be found, employing whatever means are necessary. Vickers tends, this is quoting now, Vickers tends to think like a gangster, one admirer comments. Continuing the quote, he can understand trends and then change the rules of the game so they are advantageous for your side. Round 3 in the War on Terror is all about bending, breaking, and reinventing rules in ways thought to be advantageous to the United States. Much as coin had supplanted shock and awe, a broad-gauge program of targeted assassination has now displaced coin as the prevailing expression of the American way of war. The United States is finished with the business of sending large land armies to invade and occupy countries. Secretary of Defense Gates made the definitive statement on that subject, remarking that anyone proposing to replay Iraq or Afghanistan anywhere in the Middle East or Asia ought to have their head examined. The United States is now in the business of using missile-carrying drones and special operations forces to eliminate anyone, not excluding U.S. citizens, the President of the United States decides to eliminate. Under President Obama, such attacks have proliferated. This is America's new MO, our new way of war. Paraphrasing a threat issued by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, a Washington Post dispatch succinctly summarized what this implies. I'm now quoting the Post, indirectly quoting Clinton. The United States has reserved the right to attack anyone who it determined posed a direct threat to U.S. national security anywhere in the world. Furthermore, acting on behalf of the United States, the President exercises this supposed right without warning, without regard to claims of national sovereignty, without congressional authorization, and without consulting anyone other than Michael Vickers and other members of the national security apparatus. The role allotted to the American people is to applaud, if and when notified that a successful assassination has occurred. And applaud we do. For example, when a daring raid by members of SEAL Team 6 secretly entered Pakistan to dispatch Osama bin Laden with 2 neatly placed kill shots. Vengeance too long deferred made it unnecessary to consider what second-order political complications might ensue. How round 3 will end is difficult to forecast. The best we can say is that it's unlikely to end anytime soon. As Israel has discovered, once targeted assassination becomes your policy, the list of targets has a way of becoming infinitely expansible. So what tentative judgments can we offer regarding the ongoing war on terror? I will offer 3. Operationally, a war launched by the conventionally minded has progressively fallen under the purview of those who inhabit what Vice President Dick Cheney once called the dark side, with implications that few seem willing to explore. Put simply, the war is increasingly hidden from public view. Strategically, a war informed at the outset by utopian expectations, remember all the rhetoric about eliminating evil and advancing the cause of women's rights, that war continues today with no concretely stated expectations whatsoever. The forward momentum of events displacing serious consideration of purpose. Politically, a war that once occupied center stage in national politics has now slipped to the periphery. The American people turning to other concerns and entertainments, with legal and moral questions left dangling in midair. Overall, what lessons can we take away from this trajectory of events? From Rumsfeld to Petraeus to Vickers, from liberation to pacification to assassination. Well, no doubt when it comes to the way that national security decisions are made and implemented, to the way that the Pentagon plans and conducts its wars, and to the way that U.S. forces organize and equip themselves, there are any number of lessons to learn. Yet to my mind, for us as citizens, one lesson looms above all others: the danger of hubris and the imperative of modesty, even humility, when confronting the forces of history. For if there's one reason we got ourselves in our present fix, it's immodesty compounded by an absence of self-awareness. To be sure, modesty has seldom been an American strong suit, especially when positioning the United States in the stream of history. We tend to fancy that it is America's role to determine history's course. To a very considerable extent, the global war on terror, at the outset at least, was based on the presumption that history could be coerced into doing our bidding. I, for one, am willing to concede that such arrogance may once have served the nation's purposes. But to my mind, that day has long since passed. Or to put it another way, with the transition from Rumsfeld's war to Petraeus's war to Vickers's war, to expect that world to do our bidding has become the height of folly. Henceforth, the requirement is going to be to live within history rather than to determine its course. Put simply, the so-called American century, if it ever existed, has come to an end. And if true, the consequences of that fact deserve careful reflection, especially by us ordinary folks. Some older members of this audience will remember when that evocative phrase, American century, entered the political lexicon. It dates from February 1941, when it appeared as a title of an essay in Life magazine under the byline of publishing mogul Henry Luce. The immediate purpose of Luce's essay was to advance the case for U.S. entry into World War II. And in that regard, it made quite a splash, as Luce very much intended. Yet the rush of events soon transformed the phrase American century into something much more than a bit of journalistic ephemera. It became a summons, an aspiration, a claim, a calling, and ultimately the shorthand identifier attached to an entire era. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the United States had indeed ascended, as Luce had forecast, to a position of global primacy. Here, it seemed, was the American century made manifest. I, for one, love Luce's essay and regularly have my students read it. I love its preposterous grandiosity. I delight in Luce's utter certainty that what we have is what they want, need, and by gum are going to get. What can we say and foresee about an American century? Luce asks in this essay. It must be a sharing with all peoples of our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, our magnificent industrial products, our technical skills. I love, too, the way that Luce guilelessly conjoins religion and politics. The son of Protestant missionaries, he depicts the United States as the Redeemer nation, employing language that would make even Mitt Romney blush. We must now undertake to be the Good Samaritan of the entire world, Luce wrote. How to do that? To Luce it appeared quite simple. He pronounced it America's duty, quote, as the most powerful and vital nation of the world to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit and by such means as we see fit. Would God or Providence have it any other way? To my mind, Luce's essay manages to be
utterly ludicrous and yet deeply moving. Above all, this canonical assertion of singularity, identifying God's new chosen people, is profoundly American. Alas, the bracing future that Luce confidently foresaw back in 1941 has in our own day slipped into the past. If an American century ever did exist, it's now ended. History's moving on, although thus far most Americans appear loath to concede that fact. Historians should be the first to acknowledge the difficulty of identifying historical turning points. Back in the spring of 2003, around the time U.S. troops were occupying Saddam Hussein's various palaces, President George W. Bush felt certain that he'd engineered a historical turning point. More than a few otherwise sober observers agreed, but mission accomplished turned out to be mission just begun. Those who celebrated the March on Baghdad as a world-altering feat of arms ended up with egg on their face. Still, I'm willing to bet that future generations will look back on the period between 2006 and 2008 as a turning point of sorts. Here was the moment when what remained of the American century ran out of steam and ground to a halt. More specifically, when Bush, at the end of round one, gave up on victory in Iraq, thereby abandoning expectations of U.S. military power transforming the entire region. And when the Great Recession during round two brought the American economy to its knees, consequence of habitual profligacy coming home to roost, well, at that point, Luce's formulation lost any resemblance to reality. Politicians insist otherwise, of course. Has the American century breathed its last? Well, Governor Romney leaves no room for doubt where he stands on the matter. Here he is in a speech he made last October describing his vision of national security policy, quoting Romney, "I am guided by one overwhelming conviction and passion. This century must be an American century. In an American century, America has the strongest economy and the strongest military in the world. In an American century, America leads the free world and the free world leads the entire world. This is America's moment. We should embrace the challenge, not shrink from it, not crawl into an isolationist shell, not wave the white flag of surrender, nor give in to those who assert America's time has passed. That is utter nonsense." Of course, foremost among those waving the white flag of surrender, according to Romney, is President Barack Obama. Yet Obama's expressed views align closely with those of his would-be challenger. "America is back," the president barked during his most recent State of the Union address. "Anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who tells you that America is in decline or that our influence has waned, doesn't know what they're talking about." Well, as with most contemporary political speech, this qualifies as pure malarkey. Among the conjurers of imperial dreams in Washington, the American century might live on. In places like Newark, or Cleveland, or Detroit, where real people live, maybe here in Oregon too, the American century is finished. Now, as a sometime member of the historical fraternity, count me among those more than content to consign the American century to the past. After all, the past is the historian's turf. Exploration of the myth-enshrouded territory encompassed by the American century has actually barely begun. And grasping what this era actually signified and what it yielded promises to be an exciting scholarly enterprise. Yet from a jaded, not to say cynical, observer of international politics, the passing of the American century elicits a more ambivalent response. I'd like to believe that the United States will accept that outcome gracefully, rather than attempting to resurrect Luce's expansive vision, I'd prefer to see American policymakers attend to the looming challenges of multipolarity, which stare us in the face and which have become all the more apparent during the decade when we've been wasting vast resources on unnecessary wars. Averting the serial catastrophes that befell this planet starting just about 100 years ago, when the previous multipolar order began to implode, should keep people in Washington busy enough. But I suspect that's not going to happen. The would-be masters of the universe orbiting around the likes of Romney and Obama won't be content to play such a modest role. They will continue to peddle the fiction that with the right cast of characters running Washington, the world will once again march to America's drumbeat. Evidence to support such expectations is exceedingly rare. Taken a look at Iraq or Afghanistan lately? But no matter. Insiders and would-be insiders will insist that right in their hip pocket, they've got the necessary strategy. Strategy is a quintessential American century word, ostensibly connoting knowingness and sophistication. Whether working in the White House, the State Department, or the Pentagon, strategists promote the notion that they can anticipate the future and manage its course. Strategists want you to think that they are smarter than you are. Yet the actual events of the American century, and especially the events of the post-9/11 era, belie any such claim. Strategy is actually a fraud perpetrated by those who covet power and are intent on concealing from the plain folk the fact that the people in charge are flying blind. With only occasional exceptions, the craft of strategy was a blight on the American century. Faced with realities that include, within the last decade alone, an inability to anticipate whether the events of 9/11, the consequences of invading Iraq, or the revolutionary upheaval in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world, an inability to control. With wars begun in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, along with various and sundry financial scandals, economic crises, and natural disasters exposing the limits of American power, influence, and perspicacity. An inability to afford, as manifested by a badly overstretched military, trillion-dollar annual deficits, increasingly unaffordable entitlement programs, and a rapidly escalating foreign debt. An inability to respond, demonstrated by the dysfunction pervading the American political system, especially at the national level, whether in the Congress, at the senior levels of the executive branch, or in the bureaucracy, and an inability to comprehend what God intends or the human heart desires, with little to indicate that the wonders of the information age, however dazzling, the impact of globalization, however far-reaching, or the forces of corporate capitalism, however relentless, will provide answers to such elusive questions. Given all this, Americans today would do well to take with a grain of salt claims coming from Washington that the U.S. is capable of directing history's future course or completing the world's redemption. In light of such sobering facts, which we ignore at our peril, it no longer makes sense to pretend that the United States is promoting a special message in pursuit of a special mission. Like every other country that confronts circumstances of vast complexity and pervasive uncertainty, the United States is merely attempting to cope. Prudence and common sense should oblige us to admit as much. What does the passing of the American century hold? To answer that question, inquisitive students of international relations might turn for instruction to television commercials currently being aired by Allstate Insurance. You've probably seen them. The ads feature a character called Mayhem, who, unbeknownst to you, hangs on the side of your car or perches on your rooftop concocting mischief. The message is clear. Be alert. Mayhem is always lurking in your path. Throughout the American century, and especially over the course of the past decade, mayhem mocked U.S. strategic pretensions. Mayhem whispered in the ear of whoever happened to occupy the Oval Office. Mayhem's agents infiltrated the National Security Council, sowing falsehoods. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff met in the Pentagon, mayhem had a seat at the table. Mayhem freely roamed the halls of the Capitol, although congressional dysfunction in our own day may have rendered such efforts redundant. Having learned nothing from the American century, present-day strategists, the ones keen to bomb Iran, confront China, and seize control of outer space as the so-called ultimate high ground, these people will continue the practice of doing mayhem's bidding. As usual, the rest of us will be left to cope with the havoc that results, albeit this time without the vast reserves of wealth and power that once made an American century appear plausible and that led arrogant and ignorant people in Washington to send young Americans like Mike to feed needless and unwinnable wars. Thank you very much. So, that's okay. We still got like a half an hour for questions and discussion, and as Julia would like people to come to the mics, I guess. So,
well, I'm a bit nervous. I haven't prepared a speech.
you have one?
I wrote this on January 24th, 2007, and I dug it out before tonight's talk.
So yours is not as long as mine, right?
No, it's only 2 pages.
Okay. No.
But it's single-spaced,
Oh.
and I don't want to hang to it.
So you probably ought to just give us a quick summary, because you can see we got a lot of people lined up.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, I entitled this The Primacy of the Palestinian Issue. And it comes to the question, should we not be trying to discover the proper strategy for dealing with the phenomenon of terrorism against the USA? Strategy is a good thing. What we've got now are the wrong strategies. And many people, including James Bamford, General Zinni, Jimmy Carter, and the study group on terrorism, have come to the conclusion that the Israeli-Palestine issue has to be settled. Do you think that there is a key there toward peace?
Well, probably not to the extent that I think you do. In other words, my own assessment would be that the causes of animosity directed toward the United States and the West from within the Islamic world, the causes are multiple. They are deep-seated. We don't have to endorse them. We don't have to agree with them. But this is an issue that goes far beyond simply the question of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. That said, I do believe that the United States has a vital national security interest in addressing the so-called grievances of the Palestinian people, not because I think that were we to do so, the whole problem of violence from the Islamic world would disappear, but because doing so, providing the Palestinians with a state, would in a sense rob the terrorists of one of the arguments that they make to try to endow their efforts with some moral justification. I actually seriously doubt that Osama bin Laden was motivated in any significant way by his concern for the Palestinians, but he used that issue as a way to try to validate or legitimate his actions. And we should want to strip away any such claims of legitimacy, and creating a Palestinian state arguably would contribute to that end. Now, that said, I don't believe that there is any easy way for us to achieve that outcome. Quite frankly, if there were, it would have happened long ago. And here I think we need to acknowledge the extent to which U.S. interests in Israeli interests, that is to say, U.S. interests with regard to the Palestinian issue, Israeli interests with regard to the Palestinian issue, I think are at quite cross purposes. And when I look at the problem from the perspective of Israeli Jews, I myself would not be particularly enthusiastic about creating a genuinely sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank. To do so would probably undermine Israeli security from the perspective of the Israelis. There's no easy way to get this done, although, yes, it's a matter of some urgency that we should attempt to get it done. Yes.
My name is another Mike Peterson, and I, like you, served in Vietnam from 68, 69, and 70. Most significantly, I served with the Combined Action Platoons, the Marines' other war in Vietnam, and the predecessor of COIN, if you will. And I voted for progressive candidates. You may or may not know this: Peter DeFazio and Jeff Merkley, and to a lesser extent, Ron Wyden. I have, quote, petitioned our government for redress of grievance, and petitioned, and petitioned, and petitioned. What more can I, and by extension, us, we do?
Well, I mean, I'm not particularly optimistic on this matter, but I have come to believe, this is not a good answer, it's not a satisfactory answer, but I've come to believe that all we can do is all we can do, that we are called upon to be good citizens and to express that in whatever way seems to make sense for us. Now, for some people, citizenship demands activism. For some people, citizenship can be writing books and articles. For some people, citizenship is raising a family that has decent values and mowing the lawn and being a good neighbor to the people who live next door. And we do our best. We do our best with no expectation that somehow our efforts are going to have any significant impact, but we do our best because that's our obligation. That's our civic obligation. And if we do that, the day that we breathe our last and we prepare to go meet our Maker, we can at least take some satisfaction in the fact that, darn it, we did our best. And the people in Washington are going to keep doing what they're doing.
You've mentioned that we have watched our country decline, and all of us know that has happened. Our industrial base here in the Northwest, our fishing and timber base, all of that is declining by millions and millions of jobs. But we are still in the business of the military and the business of war. And all over the country, bases of various kinds, as well as contracting, private contracting out of the war's business, exists and is a powerful economic force. How can we possibly get out of the business of war when, in fact, it may be one of our mainstays of our economy?
Well, I'm going to do my best to answer that question, and only thing I'm going to ask you, sir, would you please give me a question that I can give a positive, upbeat, and optimistic answer to, because I'm not going to be able to give a positive, upbeat, and optimistic answer to this question, because those forces are powerful and they are deeply inbred. I don't for a second think that we can simply point to the behemoth of the military-industrial complex and say, there it is, that's the answer for everything, that's the problem. There is a behemoth called the military-industrial complex. It's part of the problem, but it's not the whole problem. I think that this is where the absence of self-awareness and the aversion to critical thinking poses such a problem for us. We were in Iraq for about a decade. Not quite, I guess. 8 years? 8 plus. It's a deeply unsatisfying, unsuccessful, costly experience. There are estimates that the Iraq War is going to cost us, by the time the last bill is paid, meaning when the last veteran passes away decades from now, probably going to cost us somewhere in the vicinity of $4 to $6 trillion. One would think that this episode, now that it's passed, would be the subject of some consideration, reflection, attempt to reach conclusions. Hadn't happened. The Iraq War has already vanished down the memory hole. And my point is to say that unless we are willing to take stock of where the trajectory of U.S. policy has taken us, it's difficult to understand how we're ever going to be able to break these habits. This is where I think the absence of a legitimate, serious two-party system has such a devastating effect. I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not an isolationist. I don't believe in world peace. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I'd like to have a strong military. But I also think that we need to have another party that constantly is questioning the tendency to emphasize power and its uses as essential. So, to really overstate it, let's have a war party, let's have a peace party, and let's have those two parties then argue it out in Washington in hopes that somehow the process of arguing out would produce a synthesis that would be rational, reasonable, and logical. In theory, that sounds good. Problem, of course, is we have War Party A and War Party B. And they pretend to disagree fundamentally on these matters when, in fact, to 95% of the time, they, in fact, concur. Absent a real two-party system, we're not going to have a real debate, and therefore the habits to which we have become so accustomed continue regardless of cost and regardless of consequences. Okay, sir, give me the softball.
I'll do my best. It's a question of a different sort. I was really struck by what I took to be your concluding distinction between nation states that arrogantly try to determine the course of history on the one hand, and nation states that with some humility try to cope with the flow of history. But I think your thesis, if I could call it that, would be stronger if there were some comparative analysis. And so my question is, can you point to examples of this conflict or turning point, if I could call it that, or choice, fork in the road, for other nation states outside of the United States, or perhaps for America at earlier points in its history? Your lectures come primarily from the last 20 years, the last 2 decades, and it's a very narrow basis for a grand thesis.
So, powers, great powers that have been able to accurately gauge changing circumstances and respond in sensible ways. Well, one example, a modest example, I think would be Great Britain at the end of the 19th century. My oversimplified version of the story would go like this. Britain was the closest thing to a global hegemon that existed during the 19th century. And as we get to the end of the 19th century, really there are two challengers to British hegemony. There's Germany, and there's the United States of America. Germany nearby, the United States of America far away. Germany expressing its aspirations largely in a military context, the United States at that time expressing its aspirations in an economic, commercial context. German behavior clearly posing a threat to British dominion, American behavior maybe not so much. And faced with this relative economic decline on the part of Great Britain, their economy was still growing, but growing far less rapidly than the German economy and the American economy, the Brits made a choice. And the choice was to prioritize the German threat and to do what was necessary to ensure that there would not be a military competition with the United States. And they did that in some very specific ways. For example, negotiating a treaty with the United States that conceded to the United States the prerogative of building a canal through the Isthmus of Panama. Now, you might say, who are the Brits and the Americans to be making this treaty, given that neither one of them, but that's another matter. And repositioning British naval forces, remember that the Royal Navy was the ultimate expression of British power, repositioning British naval forces out of the Western Hemisphere, and in effect thereby conceding to the United States dominance of the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Brits did a whole lot of other things that were stupid, and obviously, as you follow the story of British power into the 20th century, it's not exactly a good news story in many respects. But I do think that there was some level of awareness and capacity to adjust that they manifested at the time.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I think we've heard you say that it is very important in our interests to understand and react to the perspectives of Israel in the Middle East. My question to you is, why is it not that we hear you say we need to take a look at what are our perspectives in the Middle East, particularly based on the growing hatred amongst Arabs, some of it as specified by bin Laden just after 9/11, which I take seriously. Why is it that we do not consider the hatred we build in those Arabs by continuing to feed billions of dollars in support of an aggressor Israeli state?
Well, I think I said we should. I mean, my point I was trying to make is that, to my mind, in trying to analyze a policy problem, it is important to try to take into account, and indeed to take into account with a certain amount of empathy, the perspectives and concerns of all of the parties to the problem. And Israel is a party to this problem. And one needs, I think, to appreciate the way things look from their point of view. Now, one might say, well, why are you paying so much attention to their point of view and not to the point of view of the Palestinians? And quite frankly, there's a lot of answers to that question, and one of them is, guess who's got nuclear weapons and guess who doesn't? So
Israel
there
has
are...
nuclear weapons? Wow. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, they do.
Yes.
And one needs to take that into account, it seems to me, in considering how to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian problem. That's all I'm trying to say.
My question is, to what extent were the people who actually planned Iraq and Afghanistan successful, extremely successful, in reshaping the American environment. I mean, look around us, there are no college students here. That's because of the all-volunteer force. That's because, I mean, there are some. I'm just saying, it's not like there are...
Not as many of you as there should be.
Yeah. So $1 trillion go to defense. There's no peace dividend. That's what Cheney wanted in 1992. There's no draft. There's Homeland Security. There's an imperial presidency, which Obama endorses.
Yeah, but it just...
This is success. Mission accomplished. What went right is the real question. Not what went wrong, but what went right.
Well, I disagree. I mean, I disagree in the sense that you get some chronology problems here, I think. Let's take the issue of the all-volunteer force. Dick Cheney didn't invent the all-volunteer force.
Rumsfeld endorsed it with Milton Friedman in 1967, and he brought it about in the Ford administration. So
well,
this has been the plan all along.
Okay, all right. Okay, I have a feeling there's nothing I can say. So
well, I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm just saying there is agency. There is agency.
Okay. I disagree. I mean, I disagree in this sense that very few people anticipated the consequences of eliminating the draft and embracing the so-called all-volunteer force, which has become what the founders would have termed a standing army. I think there were some people at the time, but very few at the time, who said that the long-term policy implications and the long-term implications for American democracy of ending the draft are going to be negative. Indeed, the vast majority of people at the time said, great, we're done with the draft, and it's going to make this country a better one. So I don't think that if I may say this, your view is suggestive of kind of a conspiratorial explanation that I think gives these people more credit than they deserve, that they're not capable of formulating and implementing a master plan of this type. I think they tend to be more opportunistic than that. That, for example, I think it is true that after 9/11 occurred, that people within, not all people, some people, probably Cheney, certainly Paul Wolfowitz, maybe Rumsfeld, instantly recognized that the 9/11 attacks provided a ready-made opportunity to go after Saddam Hussein, and they had their gun sights trained on Saddam Hussein years before for various and sundry reasons. But again, it was an opportunistic response to an event rather than something that had been carefully plotted out in advance. Just my view.
This is kind of an offshoot of that question, and it was a nice introduction, actually. But in the end of New American Militarism, you give a number of outlines of things, practical things to do.
Now, this is a book that was published in 2005, and if you think I remember what's in the conclusion, you're mistaken. But don't make me defend that.
No, it's fine. But in your end discussion, you talk about revamping and reintroducing the citizen soldier,
right?
And through the AVF, and you give a number of practical methods of potentially getting more citizens involved in the military and proper incentives. One thing I thought that seemed to taper off, and you really didn't finish the thought, was in getting elites involved. You mention it, but I wonder if you've developed that idea further of how to act, because some of your policies made a lot of sense for middle class.
Well, I'll tell you what, I thought I had a good argument until I came here, because I understand that if you're an in-state resident of Oregon, you can go to this wonderful university for $8,000 a year. And, my idea was that anybody who serves gets free education anywhere in the country that they can get in, to include places like Boston University, where it costs like $52,000 a year to go. And that as higher education becomes more and more expensive, as it is everywhere else other than here, that providing that kind of a financial incentive wouldn't necessarily get the so-called 1% to send their kids to the military, but could potentially give a bigger, provide the military access, I'm not phrasing it quite the right way, to a larger swath of the middle class. And so that this gap between the military and society, which really everybody acknowledges exists now, to include the senior military leadership, that would to some degree close that gap. You know, there's a new book out by a guy named James Wright, who was the president of Dartmouth, former Marine. It's basically a history of civil-military relations, bemoaning the gap. And one of the things that he says at the end, and I think maybe this is even more pertinent, is that it's not simply that we let somebody else's kid go fight the war, most of us, but that we don't pay for the war. And that even if we can't curb the militaristic tendency of Washington by reshaping the character of the military, if we simply required us to pay for the wars that they start, that in and of itself would be a source of some restraint. But of course, they, and here's maybe where I do agree with conspiratorial, they don't make us pay for the wars. And so we all have this pretense that it's somehow for free. So I wish we'd pass a war tax every time somebody's got a great idea to go invade a country or liberate someplace.
Thank you.
In my quest to try to understand the method to their madness, I came across a number of elites, both on the British and American side, who talked about redrawing the boundaries of the OPEC countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran.
When did these plans emerge?
Over many years, both before and after 9/11. And the most notorious was Mr. Ralph Peters, who I believe was also a colonel, in Armed Forces Journal, which is not everyone's favorite reading material, calling for redrawing the boundaries of these countries using ethnic conflict to control the oil. And the State Department actually had to send diplomats throughout the region to tell people, no, this is not really our policy. But if you look at that, you know, it makes a lot more Machiavellian sense. And I would reference that the leading champion in the United States Senate for doing that to Iraq, who got 3/4 of the US Senate to endorse a resolution doing this, was a senator named Joe Biden. I think he has a new job these days. And in terms of the presidency, I was born in the 60s. I didn't go to Vietnam. But the day before I was born, we had a president who called off the endless war paradigm. He said that we should end the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, and he signed an order to start pulling out of Vietnam, and 2 months later, Curtis LeMay and Allen Dulles removed him from office. And the reason that we have endless war is because we don't really have democracy. It's a sham. The Roman Republic has fallen. We've crossed the Rubicon, and now we're dealing with the consequences of not wanting to do it. I think the question's kind of obvious. You know, what do you know about the new military map that Cheney and Biden were pushing?
Well,
and about Kennedy's effort to turn off the Cold War and how they got thwarted.
I'm one of the guys who think that Oswald did it. So. So, but
Kennedy vowed that if he was given the presidency, he would reopen the investigation,
and lo and behold, he was killed.
And he was killed too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just one of these guys who I'm not persuaded. But let's go to the other two pieces. First of all, and this is on TV. This is going to be broadcast to the entire world. Okay. Ralph Peters is a nut, and so to take seriously any of his mutterings is somehow indicative of what serious people in Washington think, I think would be a big mistake. All right. Now, let's go to the next part, Biden. All right. I would not read, but my understanding of what Biden proposed was this. Here we are in the throes of this war, which is a mess, the Iraq war, which is a mess, having a considerable debate in the country about how we're going to get out of this mess. And Biden's proposal basically was, if the primary problem is a civil war of irreconcilable groups, Shias, Sunnis, and Kurds, then in order to achieve some level of stability, would it not make sense to devolve this artificially created country, artificially created by Great Britain in the wake of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, let it devolve into its natural parts, and then everybody can get along and some level of peace will occur. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure that was entirely stupid. But it wasn't actually the policy embraced by the United States government. It hasn't happened. So, to my mind, I don't see any real interest on the part of senior U.S. officials in redrawing the map of the Middle East. But again, we're probably going to just disagree in that. Just the way it is. Yes? Yeah, we got like 2 more questions, and then we're going to have to quit. Yes, ma'am.
My question to you is the arrogance of the United States to think that they can go and start war any place. And what happened to the suffering of the people?
What happened to what?
To the suffering of the people living in this country. How do you solve that problem? The rest of the world...
The suffering of the people, of our people?
You people have suffered a little bit, but not as much as the Afghan and Iraqi people who've been transferred all over the world to places...
Well, what do you think, ma'am? Why do you think...
I think you have a responsibility to these people and bring them back to their own country. You can't just go into a country and stir up war and not take responsibility for it. So what is your responsibility as a country?
Well, I think my answer to the question would be that there is one can make a very strong moral case that having made a hash of things, we should try to redress the harm that has been done. But if we took a poll of the American people and voted on that, how much money are you willing to spend in order to make whole the lives of the 2.5 million refugees caused by the Iraq War? The answer would be most Americans are not willing to spend a lot. And I'm not trying to say that that's good, but that's the way politics works. It's driven chiefly by matters of perceived self-interest. It's not driven by humane or Christian or altruistic considerations.
Maybe you should think of that before you start the next war. The rest of the world.
There you go. I'm with you, but I wish that we were a humane, altruistic people. I also wish the people of France were, and the people of Germany, and the people of China, and the people of Japan. Best I can tell, and I'm quite serious now, best I can tell, virtually everybody around the world tends to privilege self-interest over the well-being of other peoples. And that tends to be a reality of politics that we may lament, but seems to be pretty persistent. Yes, sir, you get the last question.
Would you comment on the role that the U.S. has played by supporting dictators throughout the world, all the way back to Chiang Kai-shek and the Shah of Iran, and how that has created a large part of the problems we have in the world?
Well, to some degree, you got to deal with the world that exists, not the world that you would like to exist. But I do think that there's a case to be made, a strong case to be made, that in acting in pursuit of self-interest, we have tended to privilege immediate, right now, considerations rather than attempt to take the longer, more enlightened view. And that certainly, to my mind, qualifies as a consistent failing of U.S. foreign policy. That said, I think we should empathize with the dilemmas that policymakers face in that regard. I mean, one could argue, let's just pick a random case here. Saudi Arabia is not a democratic country. Saudi Arabia is not a country that permits freedom of speech, freedom of religion, permits the narrowest possible definition of equality for women. They can't even drive cars. One might argue that this is not a regime that has a long-term future, that sooner or later that autocracy, which we know is actually quite corrupt, they're going to suffer the Mubarak fate. So let's get the hell out. Let's declare our opposition to the monarchy. Let's show them let's stand by our ideals. What are you guys paying for gas out here? It's like $4.20 a gallon, which, by the way, is like 60 cents more than we're paying in Massachusetts. What do you think is going to happen to the price of gas? You decide to punish Saudi Arabia. The answer is it's going to go through the roof. And as much as you might say, well, that's short-term pain that we need to endure in order to put ourselves on the right side of history, there's going to be a lot of our fellow citizens who are not going to be happy. And I think that's part of the dilemma that policymakers have to deal with, and perhaps all too often don't do a very good job of it. Thanks very much for your excellent questions. I appreciate it.
Please join us if you would like for the book sale and signing out in the lobby, and thanks again for coming tonight. Good night.